It was nearly midnight, but Emily wasn't ready for bed. Richard had turned in hours ago, after mumbling something about needing his rest for an early meeting at the community center. Emily, feeling restless and vaguely unsettled, decided to tackle the pile of unopened mail sitting on the dining room table. Her fingers deftly sorted through the envelopes, utility bills, coupons, and a few pieces of junk mail until she came across a familiar logo. It was from the travel agency they'd used to book their anniversary trip 2 years ago. She froze for a moment, confused. They hadn't planned any trips recently, had they? Curious, she tore open the envelope and pulled out a glossy itinerary. Her eyes scanned the details: weekend getaway for 2, a lakeside cabin, 3 nights, including spa treatments and gourmet dinners. Emily's pulse quickened as she read the dates. Last weekend. The weekend Richard had told her he'd been at a veterans networking event in the next town. Her breath caught in her throat. She sank into the nearest chair, gripping the itinerary as if it might vanish if she let go. The sharp edges of the paper bit into her fingers, but she barely noticed. Her mind raced. A cabin for 2. Spa treatments. Gourmet dinners. She hadn't been there. So who had? Emily's eyes darted toward the dark hallway leading to the bedroom. Her heart pounded, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of disbelief, anger, and confusion. It didn't make sense. Richard, her husband of 17 years, couldn't have done this. Could he? She reached for her phone, her hands trembling. Pulling up the calendar, she checked the dates again. He had been gone those exact days, leaving early Friday morning and returning late Sunday night. Just a boring conference, he'd said, brushing off her offer to join him. You'd hate it. A bunch of old guys talking shop. She had believed him. Why wouldn't she? But now, staring at the itinerary, the memories of that weekend began to take on a different hue. The hurried goodbye kiss, the vague texts about the event running late, the fact that he came home smelling faintly of pine, and something else she couldn't quite place. Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. Her chest tightened, her mind screaming for answers she didn't have. The man she had built a life with, the man she had sacrificed for, supported, and loved had lied to her. She felt the sting of betrayal cutting deep, like a blade she hadn't seen coming. She opened her eyes, her gaze hardening. If Richard thought he could hide this from her, he was wrong. Her years as an executive had taught her many things, but most importantly, how to uncover the truth. She set the itinerary down on the table, careful not to crumple it. Evidence. She would need it. Reaching for her laptop, Emily opened their shared travel rewards account. It didn't take long to find the booking. There it was, glaring back at her. Weekend getaway for 2, paid in full. Her eyes narrowed as she scrolled further, finding a series of charges linked to the trip. A couple's massage, wine tasting, and a private sunset dinner. The details were excruciatingly clear, each one like a nail driving into her heart. She sat back, staring at the screen. Anger flared in her chest, hot and consuming, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to react recklessly. Not yet. Emily glanced at the hallway again, half expecting Richard to appear, but the house remained still, save for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Taking a deep breath, she closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. The betrayal was undeniable, but Emily wasn't ready to confront him, not tonight. She needed time to think, to plan. She was no stranger to adversity, and she wasn't about to let this break her. Rising from the chair, Emily carefully tucked the itinerary into a folder and slid it into her work bag. Tomorrow, she would enlist Brooklyn's help. If anyone could help her unravel this mess, it was her best friend. For now, she needed to sleep, or at least try. As she turned off the lights and headed to bed, her mind was already working. Questions swirled, plans began to form, and beneath it all was a quiet determination. Richard had made a fool of her, but he would soon learn just how much he had underestimated her. The night grew colder, the house bathed in silence, but Emily's resolve burned steady and bright. Emily Williams had always believed in building a life brick by brick, steady, deliberate, and unwavering. From her modest beginnings to her current position as a senior executive at a prominent accounting firm, she had worked tirelessly, never losing sight of the values instilled in her by her parents. loyalty, dedication, and hard work. And for 17 years, she'd poured those same values into her marriage with Richard. Their home was a picturesque craftsman-style house on a quiet suburban street, complete with neatly trimmed hedges and a white picket fence. To the outside world, Emily and Richard were the picture of stability, a hard-working executive wife and her charming, retired Army veteran husband. But beneath the surface, Emily often felt the cracks widening. It wasn't always this way. Early in their marriage, Richard had been her rock, supporting her ambitions while regaling her with tales of his days in the military. But in recent years, something had shifted. Richard, once so attentive and proud of Emily's accomplishments, seemed restless in his retirement. The man who used to bring her coffee before her early meetings now seemed more interested in his own new projects. One particular evening stood out in Emily's mind, a memory tinged with both warmth and unease. It had been 3 weeks ago. She had just received word of her promotion, a step up to executive partner, a position she'd worked toward for over a decade. The news had come in the form of an email, and Emily had spent the entire drive home rehearsing how she'd tell Richard. She even picked up his favorite bottle of whiskey to celebrate. "Richard," she called out as she stepped into the house, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The comforting aroma of fresh-baked cookies from their neighbor's kitchen wafted through the open windows. She set her bag down on the entryway table and walked into the living room. Richard was sprawled in his favorite armchair, flipping through channels with the remote. The television flickered in the dim light, casting a blue glow across his face. "Hey, Em," he said without looking up. She hesitated for a moment, the excitement she'd felt on the drive home faltering slightly. "I've got big news," she said, her voice bright as she sat down on the armrest of his chair. Finally, he looked at her, one brow raised. "Oh, what's that?" "I got the promotion." "Executive partner," she said, unable to keep the smile from spreading across her face. Richard blinked, then gave a small, distracted smile. "That's great, Em. Really great." He patted her hand briefly before turning back to the television. "You've worked hard for it." Emily waited for more, some sign of the pride or enthusiasm he used to show. But instead, he flipped the channel again, landing on a sports recap. "By the way," he added, as though it were an afterthought, "I'm heading to the community center tomorrow. They want me to help organize this veterans event." "Oh," Emily said softly, her excitement dimming. "That sounds nice." "You know how these things go," he continued, his tone casual. "It's good to stay busy." He glanced at her and smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Besides, you've got your work, and I've got mine. Keeps us balanced, right?" She nodded, though a tight knot began to form in her stomach. That night, she set the whiskey on the counter and poured herself a glass instead of opening it together. Sitting alone in the quiet kitchen, she tried to tell herself that Richard's indifference was just a fluke, that he was tired, distracted, or simply preoccupied. But deep down, the unease lingered. As the weeks passed, more signs emerged. Richard spent more and more time away from home, always with vague explanations, meetings, errands, lunches with old Army buddies. He'd smile and wave her off when she asked for details, saying, "Nothing worth talking about, Em. You know how it is." She tried to keep herself busy, throwing her energy into work and brushing off her growing concerns. But the distance between them was undeniable. He didn't ask about her day anymore, and when she tried to share, he would nod absently before changing the subject. One Sunday afternoon, Emily found herself sitting on their back porch, staring out at the overgrown flower beds. Gardening had once been her favorite pastime, but she couldn't remember the last time she picked up a trowel. She used to lose herself in the rhythm of planting, the feel of soil between her fingers, and the satisfaction of watching something grow. But like so many things, she had set it aside for the sake of keeping everything else running smoothly, her job, the house, and Richard. "Maybe it's time to focus on yourself," Brooklyn had said during one of their coffee dates. "You've been putting everyone else first for years, Em. What about you?" Emily had laughed it off at the time, but now the words rang in her ears. She stared at the empty flower beds, the earth cracked and dry, and thought, maybe Brooklyn's right. The wind picked up, rustling the wind chimes on the porch, their soft notes breaking the silence. Emily's gaze drifted to the driveway, where Richard's car was parked. He'd said he was running errands, but the car had been there for hours. She sighed, brushing the thought aside. Emily had always put others first, she whispered to herself. But maybe it's time to change that. It was a thought that would come back to her soon enough, far sooner than she could have imagined. It began with a sound, a faint buzz in the stillness of the night. Emily was half asleep, her head sinking into the soft pillows of their king-size bed. The noise, persistent but muted, pulled her from the edges of slumber. She opened her eyes to the faint glow of Richard's phone, vibrating on the nightstand. It cast a dim light against his sleeping form, his face turned away from her. Her groggy mind barely registered it until the vibration came again, more insistent this time. Richard stirred, groaning softly. He reached for the phone, his movements swift and deliberate. Emily watched through heavy-lidded eyes as he turned it over, glancing quickly at the screen. In the faint light, she caught a flicker of something across his face. Surprise? Concern! Before she could place it, he shifted, tucking the phone beneath his pillow. "Who's texting this late?" Emily murmured, her voice thick with sleep. No one. Just some spam," Richard replied too quickly. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a tightness that pricked at Emily's senses. She blinked, forcing herself awake as he rolled onto his side, away from her. The faint scent of his cologne still lingered, a smell she used to find comforting but now seemed oddly out of place this late at night. She stared at his back, the steady rise and fall of his shoulders, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. The next morning, the moment lingered in Emily's mind as she prepared for her day. Her routine, usually a whirlwind of coffee, emails, and organizing her schedule, felt heavy with unspoken questions. She brushed them aside for most of the day, burying herself in work at the accounting firm. But as evening approached, the memory resurfaced, accompanied by a nagging unease. Emily didn't want to overreact. After all, she and Richard had been together for nearly 2 decades. She knew his habits, his quirks. He wasn't the type to hide things, or so she thought. Still, her instincts told her something was off. It wasn't until the following evening that the next clue presented itself. Richard was in the shower, the sound of running water filling the house. Emily was tidying up the bedroom when she spotted his phone on the nightstand, screen face up. For a moment she hesitated, her heart thudding in her chest. She had never invaded his privacy before. But then she remembered the late-night buzz, his hurried response, the way he tucked the phone away like it was a precious secret. Her hand hovered over the device. "Just a glance," she whispered to herself, as though saying it aloud would absolve her of any guilt. The phone lit up under her touch, and her breath caught. The screen showed a text preview from a number she didn't recognize. The message read, "Had such a wonderful time last weekend. Let's plan the next one soon." Her chest tightened, as if the air had been sucked from the room. The words blurred slightly as her vision swam with a rush of disbelief and anger. She put the phone down quickly, stepping back as if it had burned her. The sound of the water in the shower continued, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside. Emily's thoughts spiraled, each one hitting her like a blow. Who was messaging Richard? What had they done last weekend? Why hadn't she noticed this sooner? She pressed her hands to her temples, forcing herself to breathe. The text was damning, but she needed more than a single message to confront him. She needed proof. That night, Emily lay awake long after Richard had fallen asleep. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with half-formed plans. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, she had made up her mind. If there was something to find, she would find it. The next day, while Richard was out running errands, Emily sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. She logged into their shared credit card account, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed in the password. The screen loaded slowly, each second stretching like an eternity. When the transactions appeared, her heart sank. There they were. A charge for a boutique spa 2 towns over, a high-end restaurant she'd never been to, and a charge at an upscale hotel, all dated from the previous weekend. Emily's stomach churned as she clicked through each charge. A couple's massage, a private wine-tasting dinner, the room rate for a luxury suite. It was all there, stark and undeniable. The man she had trusted, the man she had built her life with, had shared these experiences with someone else, not her. The realization was like a cold hand gripping her heart. But amidst the pain, a new feeling began to emerge: anger. Not the kind that made you lash out impulsively, but a slow-burning fire, controlled and deliberate. Emily closed her laptop with a quiet snap and leaned back in her chair, staring at the tiled ceiling. This wasn't just about Richard's betrayal. It was about how he had taken her trust, her sacrifices, and her love, and treated them like they were disposable. She deserved better than this, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. That evening, Emily called Brooklyn. "I need to talk to you," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Can we meet after work tomorrow?" Brooklyn agreed without hesitation, sensing the urgency in Emily's tone. The next day, they sat across from each other in a quiet corner of a cafe. Emily had brought printouts of the receipts, carefully highlighted. She slid them across the table to her best friend. Brooklyn scanned the papers, her brow furrowing. "Emily," she said softly, looking up, "I'm so sorry. But what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Emily admitted. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was firm. "But I don't want to fight. I want justice." Brooklyn nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Then, let's figure out how to get it." As they talked, ideas began to take shape. Emily's anger transformed into determination, her pain into purpose. She wasn't just going to confront Richard, she was going to make him face the consequences of his actions. That night, Emily sat alone in the living room, the receipts spread out in front of her. She stared at them for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, with a steady hand, she gathered the papers into a neat stack and placed them in a folder. She wasn't ready to use them yet, but when the time came, she would be prepared. For now, she would wait, watch, and plan. Richard may have underestimated her, but he would soon learn that she wasn't someone to be crossed. The night stretched on, quiet and still, but Emily's mind was alive with possibilities. The game had changed, and she was determined to come out on top. The rain tapped rhythmically against the window pane as Emily sat in her home office, bathed in the pale glow of her laptop screen. It was well past midnight, but sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her desk, usually neat and organized, was now cluttered with spreadsheets, bank statements, and the crisp file folder containing the receipts she had uncovered. Each paper felt like a puzzle piece in the twisted portrait of Richard's betrayal. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, her movements precise and methodical. Years of managing high-pressure situations at work had honed her focus, and now she applied those same skills to her personal life. The woman who once trusted blindly was gone. In her place was someone sharper, stronger, and determined to reclaim control. As the minutes ticked by, patterns began to emerge. She traced Richard's spending habits over the past 6 months, noting every questionable expense. Dinners at upscale restaurants, spa treatments, and boutique purchases she'd never seen. All of it laid bare in the cold, impartial language of numbers. "There you are," she whispered to herself, circling a particularly damning charge on her screen. A couple's weekend at a luxury resort. She clicked through the details, her jaw tightening. The confirmation email even listed Cleo's name. Emily let out a bitter laugh. He hadn't even bothered to cover his tracks. The next morning, Emily met Brooklyn at their favorite cafe. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sound of quiet chatter and clinking cups. Emily slid into the booth across from her best friend, her expression calm but her eyes steely. "I found everything," she began without preamble, pulling out the folder and placing it on the table. "Receipts, charges, emails, it's all here." Brooklyn glanced at the folder, then back at Emily. "You really did your homework," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. "But what's the plan?" Emily exhaled slowly, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. The warmth seeped into her skin, grounding her. "I'm moving my savings into a separate account first thing tomorrow. If he's been funding this affair with our money, I'm not letting him take another dime." Brooklyn nodded, her expression fierce. "Good. Protect yourself first. But what about him? What are you going to do to make him pay?" A small smile played at the corners of Emily's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not sure yet, but I want him to feel the weight of his choices, publicly. Brooklyn leaned forward, lowering her voice. Then we need to think bigger. If you want justice, let's make it unforgettable. Over the next week, Emily worked tirelessly to put her plan into motion. She started by opening a new savings account in her name, transferring the bulk of their shared funds before Richard could notice. Each click of the mouse felt like a small victory, a step toward reclaiming her independence. Her next move was to gather more information. Sitting in her office one evening, Emily dug deeper into Cleo's background. It didn't take long to find dirt. Cleo's name appeared in several online forums, tied to rumors of shady real estate deals and manipulative relationships with wealthy men. The stories painted a clear picture. Cleo was a predator, and Richard was just her latest victim. Emily leaned back in her chair, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Perfect," she muttered, bookmarking the pages. She knew exactly what to do with this information. The following day, she composed an anonymous tip to the local real estate board and the Better Business Bureau, detailing Cleo's alleged misconduct. She included links to the forums and hinted at potential fraud in her recent transactions. With a final click, she sent the email, a thrill of satisfaction coursing through her. Cleo's perfect facade was about to crack. Later that week, Emily and Brooklyn met again, this time at Brooklyn's apartment. They sat cross-legged on the floor, a bottle of red wine open between them, their laptops glowing in the dim light. "I've been thinking," Brooklyn said, swirling her glass. "What if we use Richard's ego against him? He loves being the center of attention, right? Let's make his downfall public." Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." Brooklyn leaned forward, her voice animated. "The charity gala he's been planning at the community center, it's the perfect stage. You could expose everything in front of all his friends and colleagues. He'd never see it coming." Emily considered this, her mind racing. The gala was only a month away, and Richard had been bragging about it for weeks. "I like it," she said slowly, the beginnings of a plan forming. "But I'll need to be careful. If he catches on too soon, he'll try to spin it." "That's where I come in," Brooklyn said with a sly grin. "I can help you prep. We'll make it airtight." Over the next few days, Emily began to implement their plan. She volunteered to help Richard with the gala, feigning renewed interest in his projects. "I've been so caught up with work," she told him one evening, her tone light and apologetic. "I'd love to be more involved. It'll give us something to do together." Richard's face lit up, his ego clearly stroked by her sudden enthusiasm. "That's great, Em. I could use an extra pair of hands." As they worked together, Emily quietly gathered intel, noting the guest list and the presentation Richard was preparing. She watched him rehearse his speech, his confidence nauseating but useful. Every detail he shared became another weapon in her arsenal. Meanwhile, Brooklyn helped refine the final steps of the plan. They created a slideshow for Richard's presentation, carefully weaving in photos and receipts that proved his affair. It was subtle enough to blend in at first glance, but damning upon closer inspection. One night, as Emily sat in her office reviewing the final details, she felt a strange calm wash over her. For weeks, she had been consumed by anger and betrayal, but now, with her plan in place, a new emotion emerged: empowerment. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was taking control. She looked out the window, the rain falling softly against the glass, and whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." The stage was set, the pieces falling into place. Richard's carefully crafted world was about to unravel, and Emily was ready to watch it happen. The woman who once sacrificed everything for the sake of harmony had found her voice, and she was determined to use it. The community center was abuzz with laughter and chatter, the low hum of polite conversations punctuated by the clinking of glasses. Warm golden light bathed the room, casting soft shadows across the polished wooden floor. Guests milled about in elegant attire, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries under the glow of crystal chandeliers. The gala was in full swing, the perfect blend of charm and sophistication that Richard had envisioned. Emily stood near the back of the room, her sequin navy dress shimmering subtly under the lights. She held a flute of sparkling water, her grip steady, despite the storm brewing within her. Her eyes scanned the crowd, pausing briefly on Richard, who stood near the stage, greeting guests with his trademark charisma. He was in his element, confident and completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Brooklyn appeared at Emily's side, a knowing smile on her lips. "It's almost time," she said quietly, her voice tinged with anticipation. Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on Richard. "Let's see how he handles the spotlight now," she murmured, her tone cool and resolute. The evening progressed seamlessly, or so it seemed. Richard took the stage to polite applause, his tailored suit, and practiced smile, making him appear every bit the distinguished host. Emily watched from the shadows, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and exhilaration. The slideshow was ready, loaded onto the laptop Richard had entrusted to her earlier. He hadn't even glanced at the files, too busy reveling in the praise of his peers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying easily over the room. "Thank you for joining us tonight to support such a worthy cause. It's been an honor to work with all of you to bring this event to life." The audience responded with more applause, and Richard basked in it, his grin widening. Emily tightened her grip on her glass, her stomach twisting with anticipation. "As part of tonight's program," Richard continued, "I'd like to share a little of what we've accomplished together this year. Let's take a look." He gestured toward the large screen behind him, where the first slide appeared, a cheerful montage of photos from previous events. The crowd murmured appreciatively, their attention fixed on the screen. Emily's pulse quickened as the slides progressed, each click bringing them closer to the reveal. Then it happened. The next slide appeared, stark and undeniable. A photo of Richard and Cleo, arms entwined at a luxury spa, their faces glowing with laughter. The timestamp was clear in the corner, aligning perfectly with the charges Emily had uncovered. Gasps rippled through the audience, the atmosphere shifting in an instant. Richard froze, his smile faltering as he glanced over his shoulder. What he began, but the slide had already changed, revealing a hotel receipt with both their names listed under the reservation. The murmurs grew louder, the audience shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some leaned in to whisper to their neighbors, while others openly stared at Richard, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. Emily stepped closer, staying near the back but positioning herself where she could see Richard clearly. His composure cracked as more slides flashed across the screen, incriminating text messages, a receipt for a couple's massage, and finally, a photo of Cleo wearing a necklace, the same necklace Emily had once questioned him about. "Stop it," Richard barked, his voice rising as he turned toward the tech crew. "Shut it off. Now." The screen went black, but the damage was done. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, the polite veneer of the evening shattered. Richard turned back to the crowd, his face flushed. "There's been some sort of mistake," he said, forcing a laugh that fell flat. "Clearly, this isn't what it looks like." Someone in the audience snickered, the sound sharp and cutting through the tension. Emily stepped forward then, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The room quieted as she approached the stage, all eyes turning toward her. "Don't bother, Richard," she said, her voice steady but carrying a quiet authority. "There's no mistake. Everything on that screen was real. I made sure of it." Richard's mouth opened and closed, his confidence unraveling as he stared at her. "Emily, what are you?" She cut him off with a sharp glance. "You thought you could humiliate me, lie to me, and spend our money on someone else without consequence." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "Well, now everyone knows the truth." The audience was silent, their collective gaze flicking between Richard and Emily. Richard's hands clenched at his sides, his carefully constructed image crumbling before their eyes. He tried to speak again, but Emily had already turned, her back straight as she walked toward the exit. For the first time in years, the narrator might say here, Emily walked away, not as a victim, but as a victor. The soft murmur of voices resumed as the door closed behind her, and Emily stepped out into the cool night air. The tension in her chest eased slightly, replaced by a sense of liberation she hadn't felt in years. The stars glittered above, indifferent to the chaos she'd left behind, but she didn't mind. She had done what she needed to do. Brooklyn joined her moments later, a proud smile on her face. "You were incredible in there," she said, handing Emily her coat. Emily nodded, her lips curving into a small but genuine smile. "It's not over yet," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "But it's a start." They walked toward the car, the faint sound of voices still drifting from the community center. For Emily, the gala marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another one, where she finally took control of her own story. And as she drove away, the night stretched ahead, full of possibilities. The morning after the gala was uncharacteristically quiet. Emily sat at the kitchen table, a cup of steaming coffee in her hands, staring out the window at the dew-covered garden. The world outside seemed so serene, the soft chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. Inside, however, her mind was anything but quiet. The fallout had been swift. Richard's humiliation at the gala had spread through their suburban community like wildfire. Whispers of his affair, Cleo's involvement, and Emily's pointed exit dominated every conversation, from the local cafe to the community center. Emily had expected some measure of satisfaction from his public disgrace, but instead she felt a strange calm, an overwhelming sense that she had finally reclaimed her power. Later that afternoon, Emily received a call from her lawyer. Sitting in her office, she listened intently as he explained the next steps in filing for divorce. "Given the circumstances, this should be straightforward," the lawyer assured her. "With the evidence you've provided and the separate account you set up, you're in a strong position." Emily nodded, her grip tightening on the phone. "Thank you. I want this over quickly." As she hung up, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. The life she had shared with Richard was crumbling, but for the first time in years, Emily wasn't afraid of what came next. She turned to her laptop, ready to dive into her work, when a notification popped up on her screen, an email from Brooklyn. The subject line read, "You're going to love this." Curious, Emily opened it. Attached was an article from a local news site. The headline read, "Local real estate agent under investigation for fraudulent practices." Emily's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. Cleo's days of manipulation were over. It wasn't just the anonymous tip Emily had sent. Others had come forward, sharing similar stories of deceit and financial misconduct. Cleo had skipped town, leaving Richard to face the aftermath alone. A week later, Emily found herself at a small art supply store downtown. The familiar smell of paint and canvas filled the air, awakening a part of her she hadn't touched in years. She wandered the aisles, running her fingers over brushes, sketchbooks, and tubes of oil paint. Her mind flashed back to the evenings she used to spend painting before life became a blur of work and obligations. By the time she left the store, her arms were full, canvases, paints, and an easel. That evening, she set up a corner of the living room, her new sanctuary. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of excitement, a sense of possibility. As the days turned into weeks, Emily poured herself into her work and her art. Mornings were dedicated to her career, where she thrived as the newly promoted executive partner, her confidence growing with each success. Evenings, however, were hers. She spent hours in front of the easel, letting her emotions flow onto the canvas. Anger, sadness, hope, it all found its place in her work. 3 months later, Brooklyn convinced Emily to submit her paintings to a local gallery hosting a showcase for emerging artists. Hesitant at first, Emily finally agreed, encouraged by Brooklyn's unwavering belief in her talent. The night of the gallery opening was a blur of nerves and excitement. Emily stood in the center of the brightly lit room, surrounded by her work. The walls were adorned with vibrant pieces that told her story, abstract bursts of color, intricate landscapes, and haunting portraits that captured the emotions she had buried for so long. Guests wandered through the exhibit, their voices a gentle hum. Brooklyn appeared at her side, a glass of champagne in hand and a grin on her face. "You've outdone yourself, Em," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "They're loving it." Emily looked around, taking in the faces of strangers who were moved by her work. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as Richard's wife, not as the betrayed woman, but as herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "For everything." Brooklyn smiled and raised her glass. Here's to new beginnings. As the evening wound down, Emily stood near the entrance, watching the last of the guests trickle out. A man approached her, his expression thoughtful as he glanced at the painting nearest him, a swirling mix of blues and golds. "This one is incredible," he said. "It feels like freedom." Emily smiled, a quiet warmth spreading through her. "That's exactly what it is." As he walked away, she turned back to the painting, her own words lingering in the air. It was a piece she had painted late one night. Inspired by the moment, she realized she could rebuild her life. Back at home, Emily sat on the porch, a glass of wine in hand. The night was cool, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny beacons of light. She thought of Richard, now living in a small apartment across town, his reputation tarnished and his resources limited. She thought of Cleo, whose schemes had finally caught up with her. But most of all, she thought of herself, the woman she had become. Emily didn't just survive the betrayal, she had grown because of it. She had rediscovered her passions, her strength, and her voice. The life she was building now was hers alone, shaped by her choices and dreams. As a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, Emily raised her glass to the night sky. "To freedom," she whispered, "and to me." In that moment, she knew she wasn't defined by what had happened to her. She was defined by how she had risen from it, stronger and more alive than ever.